Welcome to our panel. You may have noticed the magical swap from Brett to Tim Adey, who's the Head of Science and Evidence for the Office of Environmental Protection. Welcome, Tim. And we also have Indy Kemal-Green from the RSPB Youth Council. Welcome, Indy.
Thank you.
And just a reminder of the theme. Are we doing enough to understand and promote the value of our seas? I was just thinking that doesn't sound right, but it is right, isn't it? And I'm going to, because everybody has spoken, I'm just going to let Indy kick off with a few reflections from that session.
Lovely, thank you.
Feel free.
This is my first ever Coastal Future, so I'm very excited to be here, thank you. So my name is Indy, I'm a 19-year-old naturalist and I live in Sherwood Forest in landlocked Nottinghamshire. Now, my perspective doesn't necessarily come from a policy or business point of view, but simply a love for our oceans and our coastal habitats, which is a love I'm sure is shared between all of us. Now, to cut a very long story short, my parents met on a whale watching boat on the Isle of Mull on the west coast of Scotland over 25 years ago. And it's a boat that I now work on as a guide in the summer, taking people all around the Hebrides. But when they first took me there when I was 10, I was absolutely staggered of the incredible biodiversity of the west coast waters. Minke whales, common and bottlenose dolphin, basking sharks, sunfish. Even had a sunfish breach, which was really cool, but it was quite a disappointing belly flop on top of the water surface, but it was very cool to see. But for years, media had me believing that these were experiences that you'd have to travel to foreign countries for, and there it was, right in front of me on the west coast of Scotland. So when I'm thinking about the question, are we doing enough to understand and promote the value of our seas, I'd say no. I think in terms of promotion, as mentioned earlier, I think lockdown was obviously a time when people became hyper-aware of all the amazing species that could be seen around our coast. Equally, the brilliant BBC series Wild Isles, which premiered in this room, also did a lot of good in that regard as well. But what I still think is missing is that true understanding of the value of our seas. And I don't think enough people realise that none of us would be here without our seas in terms of our ocean systems and ecosystems regulating our climate and providing a majority of the air that we breathe. And one of the ways that I think we should be amending this is by introducing and implementing the natural history GCSE and educating young people on biodiversity. And I know there's so many amazing people who are really banging the drum to try and make this a reality, but they are simply banging their heads against a brick wall at the moment. So what I would really like to see is way more organisations really pushing for the natural history of GCSE to be added to the curriculum, because I think that's where it all starts. Sowing the seed in that young person's mind could lead to a lifetime of love and environmental protection. So let's get on with it. Thank you.
Thank you, Indy. Okay, so we'll take the first question from Natasha.
Thank you. So we have a very popular question on Slido that's probably directed to Jack and now Tim from the Office of Environmental Protection. Two questions in one. So Jack said that we don't want missing targets to be business as usual, but it already is. How can we make the 2030 targets meaningful and not just the next milestone to be missed? And maybe as a response to that, 40 people have asked the question, is it time to end our fixation on monetary values of the environment and start talking about just relative value approach that can include emotional well-being?
Okay. So, Tim, would you like to take the targets question?
I think I need to start with this one. I think largely, and one of the reasons why we are looking into GES and the investigation was launched was not just that it is really important that we restore our oceans as soon as possible, but also that this is the first real kind of apex and big statutory target to have been missed in our existence since the OEP has been in existence. And there are lots of targets were mentioned on day one. There's also, the Environment Act targets. There's a number of interim targets for that are coming up in 2030. So really, that is part of the driver for this investigation, as Jack really articulated really well. We act in a kind of strategic way. So we're relative to the kind of challenges in the environment. We're not a big enough to be able to do everything all at once. So we do need to prioritise, and part of the reason we've prioritised that is exactly that point, is actually we need to kind of tackle this first missed target in order to set the kind of precedent for the rest, really.
Thank you. And the second question was around economics, wasn't it? Economic valuations. And a few of you had some economics in your slides. I wonder if you'd just like to provide a perspective on the importance or the maybe the different focus that you might like to see. So Jenny, you had a great slide in there.
Yeah, I think the challenge is the way society works. It is based on economy and money. And actually nature doesn't necessarily talk that language, and it can kind of feel quite uncomfortable to put it in those sorts of boxes. So we don't, but that is at the detriment to nature. So I think we need to work out how actually we can start to think about how can that be more of the economic debate. Now some of my flood colleagues talk to me all the time about assets, and how we can really get a handle on, you know, this asset delivers this much benefit. It might be to do with houses protected, but it's quite a solid thing that you can link to. But for nature, we're still in a place where we talk about those benefits. And we're starting to think about how can we see nature more as an asset, so that actually when you talk about, okay, we want to deliver flood defence here as an asset, how can nature be that asset and actually be in the same conversation? In principle, I think I agree, and that's the way we need to go, so that we can have one conversation. But as an ecologist, it makes me feel quite uncomfortable. And when colleagues say to me, right, well, tell me the dynamics of this asset and how will we maintain the standard? And I say, well, I don't want to maintain the standard. We start from something and then nature evolves and changes. So I think we've got some challenges that we need to think about in terms of how we bring nature into that conversation. But I think if we don't, we will continue down a line where actually nature doesn't have that value, where actually at the end point we say, well, here is where we can see the money in the pound, and we lose that investment in nature. So I think it's critical.
It feels like it has a place, but then I'm a little bit biased now in that perspective. Anthony, you had some economic figures in yours as well, and you kind of skirted over them a little bit, but they're actually big numbers and they're quite powerful. So what's your general sense of the use of economic valuation?
Exactly that use of it there. Actually, when you do look at the numbers, when you do start to look at the role that the past plays in communities and how much they engage with that, it's rather more than people might assume. Heritage might be just considered like a fringe thing until you realise, no, it's not fringe at all, it's really massive. And so for making that point, having those kinds of numbers that we can mobilise in this kind of audience, but also mobilise into that growth agenda, which is just so dominant at the moment, it's really important to have those numbers and for them to be robust. So I skirted over them a little, but you know, they'll be robust. And it just says this is a big thing. And I think I'd roll over from that, this point about how we think about the environment and separating it into the natural environment as opposed to an environment more generally, that causes us real problems in being able to have those joined up conversations. So, yeah.
Thank you. Should we take some questions from the room? Got any hands up? There's one at the back over there. Sort of, yes.
Thanks. Karen Daglish, manages Stronger Shores project in the North East. I'd just like to raise a point that the kind of community engagement type projects that we've heard about here are vulnerable to short-term funding cycles, meaning that, like the timeline, for example, that Fionn shared is, about 2 years or something like that? So by the time we've got things up and running, it's time to evaluate and wind down and everything that comes with that. So I'm just interested to hear about thoughts on legacy and embedding these projects into like mainstream delivery. and if there's any examples on that or any thoughts around that.
I think that's one for you, Fiona.
Yeah, sounds like it, doesn't it? Yeah, it's such a valid point, and it's a real issue that we've got to tackle. And I think it's so symptomatic of how, up until this point, we've largely been engaging with people. You know, it's always been traditionally such a nice to have, isn't it? It's like, oh, well, if we've got money to spare in our project budget, then we'll go speak to some stakeholders, but only in a time and a place that we want to speak to them. You know, and legacy has never been something that we've thought about too much in terms of our impact on the community, particularly the trauma that's left behind, you know, as a result of our departure, right? You know, I think that was so prominent to me, that really stuck out to me yesterday in Diana's talk, is how do we do that in a really sensitive, respectful, suitable way? So when thinking about the Hiraeth and Amor project as an example, for us, building in that community-led mechanism right from the very start was critical, and building in expectation setting around that. So I do really encourage you to speak to Nat as well about this, again, from a community member point of view. But the One Ocean Forum for us was essentially our local steering group on the ground. So when thinking about establishing the governance of the project and how it would run, we really wanted to make sure that the community sat right at the top of that governance apex when thinking about any and all decisions that were taken within the project. So they really have been with us every single step of the way for the past 2 years. They were made aware very clearly right from the start, our constraints within the nature of the funding that we've received. You know, I know that there are multiple funders in the room, so I really encourage you to think about, if meaningful community engagement and implementation is something you care about, reflect that, please, in the duration of the number of years that you're willing to fund for a project. That's so critical. So again, that example of walking the talk is really important there from a funding constraint point of view. But it's, you know, it's really, really difficult. So speaking really, really transparently with you all, we're in quite an upsetting position still with the Hiraeth and Amor project. We just had our last One Ocean Forum meeting, and community members were really vocal with us as to how disappointed they were that, you know, the project is ending. And Emma's nodding because she's evaluating our project, and she was in the room with me when people were telling us how upset they are. So it's something that we really need to crack, and I think local involvement right from the start is really critical for that. Identifying the continuous pathways to enable any elements of that work to continue beyond is really important. But again, it sets the tone for place-based context. Mm-hmm. You know, we can't expect communities to take ownership and continue doing the work that we want them to do if we don't involve them meaningfully in the first place right at the start.
I agree, and I wonder from the Surfers Against Sewage perspective, because you have had a very long history, you've been very on message for a long time, so how do you work with that long-term funding and just working with your stakeholders and keeping that really core principle that you have as an organisation?
Yeah, we absolutely. It's the cornerstone, or it's the foundations of our theory of change, is people power. And so for us, in a way, that can only be done when we understand that we have to have a systemic shift, so that everything has to start with the communities. Or easy to say, hard to deliver, but we make sure we have a constant dialogue with our communities, that we understand their priorities, how they want to be represented, and that we can act as a sensitive and representative intermediary, because fundamentally, in the things that we're campaigning on, this comes from the very top down, where, for example, we wouldn't have a water commission at the moment on the need to transform our water sector in the UK, were it not for the massive campaigning across the country and community-based anger, yet already in the scoping of that commission and how it wants to consult, apparently widely, it's only gone out to big businesses, finance, and a few very privileged NGOs to understand that, rather than starting with the communities first and saying, how do we interface with you? So what they're coming out with is a very technocratic way that we have to interact with the institutions and provide our evidence and data-led and all this sort of thing, rather than just being in a genuinely listening mode. So for us, we have to play a difficult dance between leading with our own agenda and enabling the communities that we work with, feeding into sort of power and that kind of structure. But I guess we start from exactly what you said, which is long-term investment in the communities that we work with. So we set up structures and we look to nurture and train people and work with us to give them capacity building and the resources they need to be able to more equitably come to these discussions. It's not easy, and I'm definitely not saying, by the way, that we're getting it right. 100% not. We're at the beginning of our journey, and we've got a lot to understand how we can also be much more inclusive in that too.
Do we have any more questions from the room? Oh, we have quite a lot, actually. I'm going to take one from this end. I know you're waving. We'll come over, but we'll take the question just from here, lady at the front. This one, yeah.
Thank you. Jasmine Sharp, Natural Resources Wales. So just to sort of pull back to the conversations about our value and GDP and things that I've written down here is added value and multiple values, is that the strongest reaction in the room today, and I think possibly even from yesterday as well, was to the video that Giles showed. And it shows that people really do have that emotional connection, and that, Giles also went on to talk about, or to show images of the protests about the water quality and getting people involved and mobilising the general public. And so is there actually a way of flipping the conversation to engage policymakers on different terms, to be using that emotive value? And Fionn talked about hiraeth, which, for those who aren't Welsh speakers, it's such a linguistically deep, rich word that really is about how people engage and feel, and Indy clearly has hiraeth. And so how do we start having conversations with policymakers about why things, if we're promoting the value of our seas, promoting that emotional connection and depth? Thank you.
Well, I feel we should get them on a paddle out. But from an ocean literacy perspective, Emma, perhaps this is one for you, which is about that kind of, it's about the connection, it's about the citizenship, it's deeper, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important to recognise that actually in things like the 25-year Environment Plan, the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, we are called to account for the total value of the marine environment, including the social, cultural, economic and ecological. That is part of our mandate as a community. And so it's not something that's not there as a policy driver. And we need to be a bit braver, I think, about moving outside current decision-making processes. Like, we are in a system that quantitative data, numbers, money is what and how decisions have been made for a very long time. But we can challenge that. We can be brave and say that needs to be different now. And I totally agree with you, Jasmine, that the feeling in the room watching the film this morning, the feeling in the rooms when we saw the films yesterday, that's the bit that matters. Like, if you ask anybody why they want to protect something, it's not because of how much, it's rarely because of how much value, economic value it means to them. It's because it's where they went as kids with their grandparents, or where they were proposed to, or where they had their first puppy, or whatever. Like, it's an emotional connection. And so through the Diverse Marine Values Project, actually, Hell Marine Consulting has been leading some work on looking at how we use some of the data and evidence that we were collecting through the arts-based methods that I mentioned to integrate that into decision-making. And that's been a really hard part of the project, because there are lots of policy blockers and barriers and kind of institutional frameworks that are really hard to push against. So I don't have the answer, I don't think, but I think we really need to challenge ourselves as a community to start stretching those decision-making processes and be brave and be willing to do that. Sure. Thanks.
Anthony, you have an intervention.
Yeah, just to run on from that, I think we do need to do a lot more to understand the relationship between biography, identity and place, because I think those are the things that link a lot of this conversation together, is that self of the way in which people's identity is so closely tied to their experience and their life experience and that of their family and their community, but then how that's interwoven with place and with that relationship with coasts and seas, either as visitors or living and working on the sea. So I think making more space for that relationship over time is really important. I think we can help with that.
For sure. Indy.
Thank you. Yeah, I just also want to mention that I think it's really important to engage the people who are already outside using the environment into basically sort of, making these messages to try and empower government and, get the right actions through. And, I was just thinking of an example earlier when you go watch a film because either you've seen a really good trailer for it, like a film like that, or you've been talking about it with friends. You say, oh, this is really good, let's go see this. So I think it's really important that although we need to get new people, essentially everybody involved in the environment, it's also really important to engage those who are already involved, outdoor activities. And what was I going to say? That was it. Just essentially not forget, because those people are so intrinsically involved with it, and they've got so much stake. And we're talking about nobody's going to care if they haven't really got a stake in it, in a stake in essentially what the issue is. So and I think and obviously there's a whole debate to be had about how we then take those messages to Parliament. But I think we definitely need to make use of everybody who has a stake and an interest in it to take that forward.
It's a great point. And I think we also have to remember, though, that we are a very particular group in this room, and there's also a lot of trauma that's associated with water for some communities, and some very diverse perspectives. So there's other steps sometimes before kind of just engaging people in water activities. Natasha.
Thank you. Not Natasha. 40 people plus.
Oh, gosh.
3 questions to cram in. Sorry, Sean, but there's a lot going on here. A comment. Thankful for today's focus on intrinsic values of our seas and beauty in the language used to reflect what the sea means to us. How can we bring this into policy? Caring about climate change and the environment is a privilege. How can we best achieve inclusion, given that approximately 25% of the UK population is in poverty? And here's the killer question, top of the pops. We always hear the excuse of not enough resources from government. How can we encourage policymakers to better focus their resources?
So let's take the first one to Tim. About resources.
So I think, our role as the OEP is to kind of hold the government to account to their own targets and commitments. And I think one of the things that is really key in doing that is spending money well. I mean, government has set a range of ambitions, and I think largely across a lot of our work, what we're really not seeing in terms of coming through is the delivery of that. And I think in some ways that's resources, but I think in other ways it may be just kind of working better. We've seen things across the day about data exchanges and data repositories and how data are used differently. I think the answer is there will never be enough money. There is always more money. Just as with all research, there's always more research. There will always be a need to spend more and more on things. So I think whilst resources are obviously a key, there's also that way of how things can work better, how that kind of systems approach can be taken to actually understand the implications of different policies and things would be my view on it.
And how about you, Jenny, from an Environment Agency perspective?
I suppose this is what I spend a lot of my days thinking and worrying about. We have a set amount of resource, and we're thinking about that resource still in kind of a past context. So not within kind of the increasing pressures of climate change, population, and the scale of things that we need to deliver. So for me, we need to think quite differently and kind of move away from, the government Environment Agency trying to lead, deliver and pay for a lot of these things, and really focus in on how do we enable more private finance to be brought into this debate. So that doesn't remove government from that equation, but there is something that needs greater focus in terms of how does government incentivise longer term funding. And for me, it looks quite different in a few years. And at the moment, we're still trying to deliver something huge and unachievable within a really small amount of resource that is increasingly diminishing.
And how about from our NGO friends, who you're used to fairly resource-strapped situations, aren't you? So what's the flip on this?
Yeah, I don't know. It might be a bit bold to say, but I'd probably
Go
say
on.
it's not really an excuse anymore. Like, yeah, we're all struggling for cash. Like, you know, it's not this surprise. So I think that's the whole point around innovation and spending time around this conference and outside the conference to really connect and find new ways of working and trying new things. I think from a community engagement point of view, and I'm really thinking about all the people that we've been working with in RIL, in Prestatyn, I think essentially what it boils down to is our sense of humanity. That's it. It's about looking after each other, and by looking after each other, we're going to want and be invested in looking after our place, you know, our coast and sea. And I think that there is a real broken relationship that exists between public service and the public that service should be serving. So how should we go about fixing that? I think one of the key things that we need to be thinking about is how can we better connect and support giving the confidence to community members to engage in decision-making processes. Because yes, it's difficult, but there are ways, you know, and I think that we should be looking to supporting local authorities, for example, to better support that engagement from a really local level for decision-making.
Fabulous. Well, we have run out of time, and there's so many more questions. But it's time for a break and a well-earned coffee. We're going to invite Natasha back to the stage. Before we do, can we just please have just a huge round of applause for our amazing panel.